Sarah Whitman has not spoken to her mother in 6 years. No screaming match. No slammed door. No single moment anyone could point to and say, this is where it broke. Just a quiet, deliberate silence that has now lasted longer than some marriages. And here is the part that unsettles people the most. Sarah says walking away from her own mother is the healthiest decision she has ever made in her life. Not the hardest. Not the most complicated. The healthiest. Somewhere right now, someone watching this video has done exactly what Sarah did, and somewhere else, a parent is sitting by a silent phone wondering what they did wrong. According to Cornell sociologist Carl Pilmer, roughly 27% of American adults, more than 67 million people, are currently living with an active estrangement from a family member. That is not a rare tragedy happening to a handful of broken families. That is 1 in 4 people you know. By the end of this video, you will understand the psychological pattern behind why people do this, and why it is almost never about one single fight. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Here is what makes Sarah's story so difficult to sit with. If you met her mother, Diane Whitman, at a grocery store or a church function, you would think she was warm, a little dramatic maybe, but harmless. Diane hosted birthday parties. She kept photo albums. She cried at Sarah's college graduation. By every visible measure, Diane was a devoted mother. So the question that will follow us through this entire story is simple, and it is the same question Diane herself still asks. If nothing truly terrible ever happened, why did her daughter disappear from her life? Was Sarah being cruel, or was she protecting something that no one else could see? And what does it say about all of us, that the people we trust the most can sometimes be the hardest people to actually be around? To understand what happened, we have to go back before the silence, back to a house in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, where Sarah grew up as the middle child of 3. On paper, her childhood looked ordinary, even enviable. Family vacations to the lake every summer. Christmas mornings recorded on home video. Report cards proudly displayed on the refrigerator. But underneath those ordinary moments, a pattern was forming, one so subtle that Sarah herself would not recognize it until she was well into her 30s. Whenever Sarah expressed sadness or frustration as a child, her mother would respond with a version of the same phrase. You are too sensitive. You are overreacting. Other kids have it so much worse than you. It was never shouted, it was said gently, almost lovingly, which made it even harder to question. By the time Sarah reached high school, she had learned an unspoken rule that she could not have named at the time but followed instinctively. Her feelings were only acceptable if they were small, convenient, and did not inconvenience her mother's version of how the family was supposed to look from the outside. When Sarah got the lead role in a school play, Diane redirected the conversation to her own achievements at that age. When Sarah came home in tears after being excluded by friends, Diane reminded her how much worse things were when Diane herself was young. Sarah began to notice something strange. She could tell her mother almost anything except how she actually felt, and somehow that felt normal, because it had always been that way. Friends who visited the Whitman household later described something they could feel but could not quite explain, a kind of performance that everyone in the family seemed to be participating in without ever discussing it out loud. Sarah's father worked long hours and rarely intervened. Her older brother learned to agree with whatever kept the peace. Her younger sister became, in Sarah's words years later, the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in their mother's eyes. Sarah increasingly became the one who noticed things, who asked uncomfortable questions, who eventually became known within the family as the difficult one. Nobody used the word scapegoat back then. Nobody had that language yet. But that is exactly the role Sarah had quietly been assigned. The moment everything changed did not look like a crisis from the outside. It happened during a Thanksgiving dinner when Sarah was 31 years old, newly engaged, and trying, one more time, to bring up something that had been bothering her for years. She mentioned, gently, that she wished her mother had been more supportive during a difficult period after a miscarriage 2 years earlier. She was not accusing her mother of anything. She was simply naming a memory that still hurt. Diane's response was immediate. In front of the entire extended family, she laughed, turned to Sarah's aunt, and said, "Here we go again, always the victim, just like her father's side of the family." The table went quiet for exactly the length of an uncomfortable breath, and then someone changed the subject, the way families are trained to do. Sarah sat through the rest of that dinner smiling, passing the mashed potatoes, laughing at her uncle's jokes, doing everything a good daughter is supposed to do at a holiday table. But something inside her had shifted permanently, and she would later describe that moment as the instant she finally understood a truth she had spent 31 years avoiding. This was never going to change, not because her mother was a monster, but because her mother genuinely did not see what she was doing, and possibly never would. 2 weeks later, Sarah sent one final text message to her mother. It said only this: "I love you, but I need space for my own well-being, and I will reach out when I am ready." She has not reached out since. What happened next is where psychology becomes more useful than judgment. Because the natural instinct, when you hear a story like Sarah's, is to ask who was the villain here. But researchers who study estrangement, including Pilmer's team at Cornell, have found something more complicated and frankly more human. Estrangement is rarely caused by one dramatic betrayal. It is far more often the accumulation of what therapists call chronic invalidation, thousands of small moments where a person's emotional reality was dismissed, minimized, or rewritten by someone with more power in the relationship. Individually, each moment seems forgivable, even minor. But stacked over 20 or 30 years, they create something psychologists describe as a survival response, not a punishment. The nervous system eventually treats ongoing contact the same way it would treat any other source of chronic stress, and it looks for an exit. There is also a concept in family systems theory that explains Sarah's role with unsettling precision. It is called the identified patient, and it describes what happens when an entire family unconsciously assigns its collective dysfunction to a single member, usually the one who notices the dysfunction and refuses to stay quiet about it. That person becomes labeled difficult, dramatic, or ungrateful, not because they caused the problem, but because naming a problem threatens the comfortable story everyone else has agreed to tell. This is why so many people who go no contact describe an identical, almost eerie feeling afterward, not triumph, not anger, but relief so profound it frightens them, because it reveals just how much energy they had been spending simply to keep the peace. And here is the detail that changes how we should understand this entire story, the detail that functions as this video's turning point. Diane Whitman, when reached indirectly through a family friend for this story, does not believe she did anything wrong. She remembers the same Thanksgiving dinner completely differently. In her memory, she was simply being playful, the way her own mother had always teased her, and she has spent 6 years genuinely confused about what she could possibly have done to deserve losing her daughter. This is not a story about a secretly cruel parent hiding a dark truth. It is something far more unsettling for most viewers to sit with. Two people can experience the exact same history and arrive at two completely different, entirely sincere versions of the truth. Diane is not lying. Neither is Sarah. That is the part that makes estrangement so difficult to resolve, and so difficult for outsiders to judge. Researchers who study reconciliation have found something else worth sitting with. Among the families who eventually did repair these ruptures, almost none of them succeeded by proving who was right about the past. The ones who reconciled had to release the need to be validated for old wounds, and instead focus only on what kind of relationship was possible moving forward, built around realistic expectations rather than an apology that might never come. For some families, that path leads back to each other. For others, like Sarah and Diane, 6 years of silence may become 7, then 10, then permanent, and both of them will continue to believe they are the reasonable one. So we are left with the question this story was always building toward. Was Sarah selfish for choosing peace over a decades-old family role she never agreed to play, or was she finally, for the first time in her life, being completely honest? Would you have recognized the same pattern happening quietly in your own family, the small comments, the redirected feelings, the unspoken rule about which emotions were allowed at the table? Estrangement is rarely about a single dramatic fight, and that might be the most uncomfortable truth of all, because it means almost any family, including yours, could be quietly building toward the exact same silence, one small, forgivable moment at a time. Tell us in the comments, have you ever gone no contact with a family member, or has someone gone no contact with you, and what do you think finally caused it? If this video helped you understand your own family a little better, subscribe, because next week we are breaking down the psychology of the family scapegoat, the one sibling everyone blames, and why that role so often follows a person for the rest of their life.